This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy. Just drop in some details about yourself and see if you're eligible to save money when you bundle your home and auto policies. The process only takes minutes, and it could mean hundreds more in your pocket. Visit Progressive.com after this episode to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
Most people don't realize how much of their personal information is being bought and sold every day. Data brokers are making billions pulling details about you from public records and the internet, then packaging and selling it, usually without your consent. That's how your information lands in the hands of scammers, spammers, even stalkers. That's where Aura comes in. Aura actively removes your data from broker sites and keeps it off. They also instantly alert you if your information shows up in a breach or on the dark web. But Aura goes beyond data protection. With one app, you get a VPN, antivirus, password manager, spam call protection, dark web monitoring, and even up to $5 million in identity theft insurance. All backed by 24/7 US-based fraud support. Other companies might just sell credit monitoring or just a VPN. Aura gives you all of that together at the same price competitors charge for just one service. Start your free trial today at aura.com/prevent. Protect yourself now at aura.com/prevent.
For decades, Bachelor's Grove Cemetery has carried a reputation unlike almost any other cemetery in America. People have reported glowing blue lights floating through the trees, a ghostly woman sitting among the graves, phantom vehicles traveling deserted roads, and even a farmhouse that appears then vanishes. Today, it's widely considered one of the most haunted cemeteries in the country. But while researching this episode, I found myself asking a different question. Was Bachelor's Grove always considered haunted? I spent hours digging through old newspaper archives, expecting to find ghost stories stretching back to the cemetery's earliest days. Instead, I found something unexpected. The earliest articles weren't about ghosts at all. They were about pioneer families, a forgotten country cemetery, and years of heartbreaking vandalism. It wasn't until the early 1970s that the newspaper record began telling a different story. That's when reports of strange lights, ghostly apparitions, and unexplained encounters started appearing in print. So how did an ordinary pioneer cemetery become one of America's most famous haunted locations? This is the story of Bachelor's Grove Cemetery and the haunting that grew around it. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Halloween Podcast. I am your host, Lyle Perez, and this is Haunted Thursday. Each week, Haunted Thursday takes us to a place where real history and ghost stories have become tangled together. Sometimes the records support the legend. Sometimes they make the story even stranger. And sometimes they show us how a haunting can grow over time. That is exactly what happened at Bachelor's Grove Cemetery. Today, the cemetery is known for strange lights, phantom vehicles, a disappearing farmhouse, shadowy figures, and the famous photograph of a woman sitting among the graves. But the old newspaper record tells a much longer story. It begins with a small pioneer community, continues through decades of neglect and vandalism, and eventually turns into one of the most famous haunting legends in America. This is not just a collection of ghost stories. It is a look at how Bachelor's Grove became haunted in the public imagination, and why people are still drawn to it today. Long before anyone claimed to see ghosts at Bachelor's Grove, This was simply home. In the 1830s, the area southwest of Chicago looked very different than it does today. Instead of highways and suburbs, there were scattered farms connected by dirt roads that wound through forests, wetlands, and open prairie. Families settled here hoping to build a life, and like so many frontier communities, they eventually needed a place to bury their dead. The cemetery that would become Bachelor's Grove was established sometime around 1844, though the exact date has been debated. Most historians agree it began as the burial ground for the small farming community that surrounded it. Over the next several decades, roughly 200 people would be laid to rest there. Even the cemetery's unusual name has become part of its mystery. Most researchers believe it was originally called Bachelor's Grove, named after Charles Batchelder, one of the area's early settlers. Over time, the spelling changed in newspapers, maps, and everyday conversation until it simply became Bachelor's Grove. Other stories claim a group of unmarried men settled nearby, or that bachelors gathered in the grove, but there's little historical evidence to support those explanations. Life here was never large or bustling, but it was active. There was a school, nearby farms, and even a ballroom where neighbors gathered for dances and community events. Families visited one another, children grew up together, and funerals were simply another part of life in this small rural settlement. Looking at Bachelor's Grove today, surrounded by thick woods and isolated from the modern world, it's easy to imagine it has always been lonely. But that's not the cemetery its first visitors knew. It was once the heart of a community. Like many rural communities across the Midwest, the one surrounding Bachelor's Grove slowly began to disappear. As transportation improved and nearby towns grew, families moved away. Businesses closed, schools consolidated, and the little farming settlement that had once supported the cemetery gradually faded into history. By the early 20th century, there were fewer people left to care for the graves of those who had come before them. For a while, the cemetery simply became forgotten. Nature slowly reclaimed the land. Trees grew thicker around the headstones. Weeds covered many of the graves. Some of the older markers leaned or sank into the ground as the years passed. It wasn't haunted. It was neglected. Then came something even worse. In October of 1958, newspapers reported that one of the cemetery's oldest monuments had been smashed into pieces. Vandals had broken the gravestone of Arthur Fulton, a respected local resident who had served as Worth Township supervisor for nearly 3 decades. His monument, which had stood for more than 50 years, was found shattered across the cemetery. Unfortunately, it wasn't an isolated incident. Over the following years, more headstones were overturned, monuments were damaged, and graves were disturbed. One newspaper article from 1965 described how several graves had been desecrated, with bones reportedly exposed after vandals dug into burial sites. Local officials and volunteers repeatedly tried to clean up the cemetery, only to see new damage appear. As I read through these articles, one thing really stood out to me. Nobody was talking about ghosts. The newspapers described vandalism, trespassing, and the sad condition of a historic cemetery that seemed to have been forgotten by time. If someone had asked readers in the 1950s whether Bachelor's Grove was haunted, there's no evidence they would have said yes. At that point, Bachelor's Grove wasn't famous for ghost stories. It was famous because people couldn't seem to stop destroying it. As I mentioned in the cold open, I spent a lot of time going through old newspaper archives while researching this episode. Honestly, I expected the ghost stories to go back much further than they do. When you hear that a place is one of America's most haunted cemeteries, you almost assume people have been reporting strange experiences there for well over a century. But that's not what I found. The earliest newspaper articles I came across talked about the cemetery's history, the families buried there, and the damage caused by vandals. Ghosts were never part of the conversation. Then, in 1973, something changed. That's the first time I found a newspaper article describing Bachelor's Grove as a haunted cemetery. The article claimed visitors had been seeing mysterious blue lights moving through the woods at night. Witnesses described glowing orbs that floated silently among the trees before disappearing into the darkness. Others claimed they had seen shadowy figures wandering between the graves or heard sounds that couldn't be explained. Just a year later, in 1974, Chicago paranormal researcher Richard Crow helped bring even more attention to the cemetery. Newspaper articles described reports of a phantom farmhouse that would appear in the distance, only to vanish as people tried to get closer. Other witnesses claimed to have seen old-fashioned vehicles driving the lonely roads around the cemetery before simply disappearing. Reading those articles, you can almost watch the legend taking shape. One story becomes another. One newspaper prints an account, then another picks it up. More people visit hoping to experience something for themselves. And with every new report, Bachelor's Grove's reputation grows a little larger. By 1975, newspapers were already referring to Bachelor's Grove as one of the most haunted places in the Chicago area. In just a few short years, the cemetery's identity had completely changed. It was no longer simply an abandoned pioneer cemetery. It had become a destination for people looking to encounter the supernatural.
When Mark, Larissa, and Lisa entered the cemetery, the plan was to split up, to keep in constant communication, and to remain calm. Things didn't go as planned.
Stories I've heard about Bachelor's Grove range from flying orbs to Al Capone's dead victims in the bottom of the pond to a house that you can't reach because it disappears once you get up close to it. There are a lot of stories, and I'd like to believe them all, but I need proof before I believe them for myself.
I've never been to Bachelor's Grove before. I can't believe you live there. You've lived here all your life and you've never gone there.
I've never been to the Grove myself.
Why haven't you ever been there?
I don't know,
Are you scared?
No, I'm not scared. I've never been to the Grove before because a lot of my friends are really afraid to go there. But I'm going to go ahead and investigate it anyway.
Then I met up with Larissa and Lisa. We made plans to sit in the Grove at night with our camcorders, videotaping, to see if anything would show up on the videos.
There's flowers in it. I think it's pretty.
Where?
Little flowers, like carved in.
Oh, I thought you meant like fresh flowers. We saw a gravesite, and there was no flower laying on it. But then a few hours later...
As more people began visiting Bachelor's Grove, the reports became harder to ignore. Not because they were proven to be true, but because so many people seemed to be describing similar experiences. One of the most common reports involved strange lights. Visitors claimed to see glowing blue or white orbs drifting silently through the cemetery and the surrounding woods. Some said the lights hovered just above the ground before fading away. Others watched them weave between the trees, only to disappear without a trace. Then there were the apparitions. Witnesses described shadowy figures standing among the headstones, only to vanish when someone tried to get a closer look. Others claimed to see people dressed in old-fashioned clothing, walking through the cemetery before simply disappearing. Over time, one figure became more famous than the rest. A woman dressed in white, quietly wandering the grounds or sitting near the graves. She eventually became known simply as the White Lady of Bachelor's Grove. Another story that surfaced over the years involved a woman who appeared to be mourning one of the graves. Several visitors claimed they watched her quietly place flowers on a headstone or kneel beside a grave in silence. In some accounts, she vanished before anyone could approach. In others, witnesses looked away for only a moment, only to find she was suddenly gone. Whether these reports describe the same woman in white or an entirely different apparition has never been established, but the story became another enduring piece of Bachelor's Grove folklore. Not every story involved ghosts on foot. Drivers traveling the lonely roads around the cemetery reported seeing phantom vehicles that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Some described an old-fashioned black car. Others claimed they encountered a horse and rider, or even a hearse, before the strange vehicles vanished into the darkness. There were stories of a disappearing farmhouse, a black dog with glowing eyes, unexplained sounds, sudden drops in temperature, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. By the 1980s, Bachelor's Grove had become a magnet for ghost hunters, photographers, and curious visitors, hoping they might witness something for themselves. Whether people left with evidence was another matter, but almost everyone left with a story. And then, in the summer of 1991, one photograph would change Bachelor's Grove forever.
You're listening to this podcast, so I know you've got a curious mind. Here's a helpful fact you may not know yet. Drivers who switch and save with Progressive save over $900 on average. Pop over to Progressive.com, answer some questions, and you'll get a quick quote with discounts that are easy to come by. In fact, 99% of their auto customers earn at least one discount. Visit Progressive.com and see if you can enjoy a little cash back. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $946 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2024 and May 2025. Potential savings will vary.
Now with McDonald's, wake up to a $4 breakfast meal deal. Wake up to a sausage McMuffin or sausage biscuit, to hash browns, and wake up to a hot coffee. Get your $4 breakfast meal deal.
Limited time only. Prices and participation may vary. Prices may be higher for delivery.
By the summer of 1991, Bachelor's Grove was already well known in paranormal circles. People came hoping to see the blue lights, catch a glimpse of the White Lady, or simply experience one of America's most famous haunted cemeteries for themselves. Then came the photograph. On the night of August 10th, 1991, members of the Ghost Research Society were conducting another investigation at the cemetery. As they had done many times before, they photographed the grounds using infrared film, hoping to capture something unusual. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary that night. It wasn't until the film was developed that they noticed something remarkable. Sitting on one of the cemetery's broken headstones appeared to be the figure of a woman. She wasn't blurred like someone walking through the frame. She wasn't transparent like many ghost photographs people had claimed before. She appeared to be calmly seated, her hands resting in her lap, dressed in what looked like old-fashioned clothing. One detail immediately caught people's attention. Through the opening beneath her arm, part of the headstone behind her could still be seen, giving the image an eerie sense of depth that has fueled debate ever since. The photograph quickly spread through the paranormal community and eventually around the world. To believers, it became one of the strongest pieces of photographic evidence ever captured at a haunted location. Skeptics argued it could have been an ordinary person who unknowingly walked into the frame, an effect of infrared photography, or simply a trick of perspective. More than 30 years later, no explanation has satisfied everyone. But here's what I found most interesting. The famous photograph didn't create the legend of the White Lady. Newspaper articles from the late 1980s were already describing sightings of a woman in white at Bachelor's Grove, years before that photograph was ever taken. The picture didn't start the story. It gave people a face to put with a legend that was already growing. And from that point on, Bachelor's Grove wasn't just a haunted cemetery outside Chicago. It had become home to one of the most famous ghost photographs ever taken. When I started researching Bachelor's Grove, I thought I was putting together another haunted cemetery episode. Instead, I found myself following the story of how a legend is born. The cemetery itself hasn't changed much over the past century. The weathered headstones are still there. The old trees still surround the grounds. The people buried there are the same people who were laid to rest by their families generations ago. What changed was the story people began telling about the place. The newspaper archives paint a fascinating picture. For decades, Bachelor's Grove was simply remembered as an old pioneer cemetery that had fallen into neglect. Articles focused on its history, its vandalism, and the efforts to preserve what remained. Then, almost like watching a switch being flipped, the conversation changed. By the early 1970s, newspapers were reporting strange lights and unexplained sightings. A few years later, the cemetery had become one of Chicago's best-known haunted locations. By the 1980s, the stories had multiplied, and after the famous 1991 photograph, Bachelor's Grove earned a reputation that spread far beyond Illinois. Does that mean the cemetery isn't haunted? Not at all. The newspaper timeline tells us when the stories became popular. It doesn't tell us whether the people reporting them were wrong. Thousands of visitors have walked through Bachelor's Grove over the years. Many have left convinced they experienced something they still can't explain. Others have visited expecting the supernatural and found nothing more than a quiet cemetery tucked away in the woods. Maybe that's why Bachelor's Grove continues to fascinate so many people. Whether you believe every ghost story, dismiss them all, or fall somewhere in between, the cemetery has become something more than a burial ground. It's become part of American folklore, and perhaps that's the real mystery. Not whether ghosts walk among the graves, but how one small pioneer cemetery became one of the most famous haunted places in America. I think what fascinated me most about Bachelor's Grove wasn't any one ghost story. It was watching the story evolve. Going through those old newspaper archives felt like watching history unfold in real time. At first, the articles were about pioneer families preserving a forgotten cemetery and the frustration of seeing it vandalized. Then, almost out of nowhere, the conversation shifted. People started reporting strange lights. Newspapers began printing ghost stories. The legends grew larger, more detailed, and more widespread until Bachelor's Grove became known around the world. Whether those stories are evidence of the paranormal or simply an example of how folklore grows, I'll leave that up to you. What I do know is this: Bachelor's Grove is a place where history and legend have become impossible to separate. Every headstone tells a real story. Every ghost story adds another chapter. Together, they've turned a small country cemetery into one of America's most enduring paranormal mysteries. And I think that's what makes Bachelor's Grove so unforgettable. You can call the Halloween Podcast hotline and leave me a voicemail at 731-400-0472. Tell me where you're from, what you've experienced, and your thoughts on Bachelor's Grove. Your story may even be featured in a future episode. If you enjoyed today's episode of Haunted Thursday, I'd really appreciate it if you'd take a moment to follow the Halloween Podcast wherever you're listening. And if your podcast app lets you leave a rating or review, those really do help more Halloween lovers discover the show. You can also keep up with everything we're doing by following us on Facebook and Instagram, or by supporting the show on Patreon. Patreon members get bonus episodes, early access, and exclusive content all year long. Thanks again for listening. Have a good night. Sources for this episode included historical newspaper archives from the 1800s through the 1990s, local historical records, cemetery documentation, published research on Bachelor's Grove Cemetery, and reports from the Ghost Research Society. As always, links to many of these sources can be found in this episode's show notes.